Let's check. Maybe. Supposedly, it says I'm live. Okay. All right. Apologies for the one person watching that this is live. You can fast forward through this if you're not watching live, so lucky you. All right, so sorry, I sound a little froggy today. Not sure what that's all about. Probably because I've been sitting in my office without saying a word for like the last 3 hours, so the voice is getting rusty because it hasn't done anything. But we're gonna get into it. So, welcome to the Anthropology Questions and Answers. I'm Professor Eric Olson here at Cuyahoga Community College. I teach anthropology courses. This semester I'm teaching human evolution, 2 sections of that. I'm teaching 1 section of archaeology. Next semester I will be teaching a section of archaeology, which is at Tri-C, which is what we call Cuyahoga Community College for short. That is Anthro 2110. I'm teaching 2 sections, although one of them isn't posted yet, but 2 sections in theory of human evolution, which is Anthro 1210, and then a section of peoples and cultures of the world, which is, despite what I do, the sun always gets in my eyes. So not much I can do about that for this one. Peoples and cultures, that's Anth 2010. And then I'm also teaching cultural anthropology, which is Anth 1010, which is an intro course. Also exciting is we have a new federal work study position that just got posted the other day. I made an announcement to my students in class. If you have questions about that, please email me. You can email the channel for questions at tricanthropology@gmail.com. That's TRIC anthropology@gmail.com. So I'm here on this live stream to answer questions that students in my class ask, or members of the general public, although this is only the second time I've done this, so I imagine it's probably just students at this point. I haven't gotten any emails as of yet from the general public yet. I think that's a band name. But since this is only the second time I've done this, the outline that we're working on is that I'm trying to answer questions in chronological order from which they were asked. So that's the way in which I'm processing them. And then also I try to do a little bit of research in advance for some of these questions if I don't know the answer off the top of my head, or at least to prepare an answer so that I'm not just rambling on and on and on. The other thing is that I learned that it really helps me to take a break because I mean, not that I can't talk for 50 minutes on end, but it's good to collect my thoughts and take a pause. So usually around the halfway mark, which is like 11:30ish on the stream, or whatever the halfway mark would be if you're watching this after the fact, that would be when I'm probably going to take a quick like 60-second break, catch up with some water and all that stuff that, like, if you were listening to a podcast, you could, and you had an editor, you could edit out every last you could edit out every last pause or gap in speaking, so that it's just bam, 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 talking. But the whole point of this is that I'm able to answer questions in a synchronous format and allow people to watch after the fact, and it's archived on YouTube, and it keeps it nice and simple from my end. So, no editing involved means I have more time to answer questions and to grade and do other things. So if it seems a little unpolished, that's why. But I have my fancy podcasting style mic, so at least I look official in that capacity. And I have books on my shelf, although I should probably move some of these books. I know most of you don't care about this, but I should probably move some of my books so that my background makes me look more studious. I mean, I've got like a couple of volumes here, but and actually, realistically, these books are going to get moved. This is sort of housekeeping stuff. These books are going to get moved because we have a Google Drive right now for the Anthropology Collections for Teaching, which we call ACT for short. And these books are recently acquired from Professor Michael Schott down at the University of Akron. And there is a smorgasbord of archaeological data in them that we're going to make accessible to people who want to use them here at West Campus. So that will probably be moving, so my bookshelves, conversely, will probably get more empty, so I might need to populate them with non-archaeology stuff. All that housekeeping stuff out of the way, let's get into this week's questions. Sorry, I'm starting to sound like a formulaic podcaster of sorts, but hey, if it keeps me on a rhythm, it keeps me on a rhythm. So let's get into it. Sorry for my mouse sounds. The mouse I use, the scroll wheel, makes this sound, so if you hear that, it's my mouse. So sorry in advance. Unless it's ASMR to you, then you're welcome. Alright, so 12/7/23 questions. So I'm just reading the date out loud. Yes, we are live streaming this on December 7th, 2023. There's one more for this year on the 14th that I plan on doing. I already have a couple questions that came in late today from students that I will definitely not be able to answer today, so they will be backlogged to next week's live stream. I haven't finalized my schedule yet for next semester, but given that I'm going to be teaching Tuesdays and Thursdays, here I am saying I was going to get into it, and now I'm just giving you more context. Let's just put a pin in that, and let's just get into the questions, all right? So we're going to start off with Lizzie's questions. She actually has a couple of questions here, and I'm going to get into them now. So question number 1 from Lizzie is, are there any signs of early human species engaging in recreational activities? Are cave paintings considered a recreational activity? So I thought about this question, and the first thing I thought of was, can we define recreational? What is recreational? So the idea of being recreation or having recreational activities is, arguably speaking, a relatively new concept. A lot of this comes from like the Industrial Revolution and the idea of what is leisure time and do we have leisure time, and sort of categorizing our activities and our daytime events and sort of blocking out time for things that are recreational. This idea that like, oh, I'm spending the next 2 hours doing something for fun. I think that is a relatively new concept that I don't think people really thought about before the 19th century, unless you were like a king or a queen or a member of like the aristocracy or the gentry. You probably weren't thinking about things in terms of recreation. Look at the history of sports, for example. Most professional sports, aside from like soccer and cricket, didn't really exist until like post the second half of the 19th century, and even then they were still rudimentary until the turn of the 20th. But this isn't a question about sports. This is a question about recreation. So really, I kind of viewed this as a question about recreation and what it would look like for foraging societies, so, hunter-gatherers, which that's a whole nother term that we could unpack for later. Hunter-gatherers, as Robert Kelly would argue, is basically just a catch-all term for what anthropologists study, so it doesn't necessarily have any meaningful analytical utility other than this is what anthropologists study. So foragers, sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying foraging societies. If we look at them as an analog, which again has its own problems, I would probably say stories and conversations had while doing tedious tasks would probably fall under sort of recreation. So this idea of like storytelling, storycraft, gossip, sort of divination, does that count as recreation? Today you have people that are big in astrology, but hundreds of years ago, that wasn't recreational. That was a part of life and just as important as going to see your chiropractor or your doctor or whatever. So these activities that kind of pass the time, if you will, while doing these tedious activities like grinding grains or cereals, weaving, whether that's baskets or fabrics, sewing, cooking. Those are just a few things that you could consider like leisure entertainments to pass the time. And really, cave paintings, if you unpack them, oh gosh, I gotta remember to watch the time because I put myself at a 5-minute cap per question, especially if I'm not looking at other things like checking the live stream to make sure I'm not getting too far afield. But cave paintings in particular, are they considered recreational? This is where it gets into muddy waters of some archaeologists would argue that cave paintings served a ceremonial purpose. So like this was sort of what we would say today in social media, or I guess not social media, but what people would say is like manifesting something. Like I want to manifest my success, my career goals. Well, the Paleolithic equivalent of that was like I want to manifest a mammoth for dinner tonight. So some have argued that these cave paintings were part of ritual ceremonies that were used to sort of bring about successful hunts. Certainly there is, I mean, what the specifics of the ritual are, we don't have any written documentation, so we don't know, but it's safe to say that they were for a specific ritual function, because most cave paintings were found in very hard to access locations. Like, not everyone, like, people probably, I don't know off the top of my head, like, I haven't studied Lascaux caves or Altamira caves or all of these other Paleolithic caves, but certainly like Mammoth Cave, which is much more recent, like within the last 12,000 years, access to parts of these caves resulted in people dying because they couldn't find their way out, or it was dark and they didn't have a light source, so they didn't know where to go, and so they starved to death. And so when you have cave paintings in a location that's hard to access, it's potentially lethal to access, that's not necessarily something that you're doing just sort of recreational. You're not going spelunking for the fun of it in those contexts. It's risky behavior, and thus there's probably some other more esoteric, symbolic meaning behind those cave paintings. So, but is that recreational? You know, that's, again, it all boils down to what you consider recreational. So I would say, you know, what we more traditionally think of as recreational, like if we're just talking cave paintings, that would be like within the last 50,000 years. So if you just want hard dates within the last 50,000 years, I would certainly say the uptick in cultural expression of things that we would consider more recreational, like artwork and design and craftsmanship and artisanship, if artisanship is a word, sort of like an art history style approach, that would probably be more within the last 10,000 years with the advent of agriculture, because again, I would associate recreational activities or sort of this creative outlet as more commonly correlated with tedious processes. So when you're, you know, not churning butter, but like grinding cereals to make flour for your bread, you can't do that unless you're doing agriculture, and that doesn't really happen until about 10,000 years ago. So that was a really, really long-winded way of answering the first question. We've got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We've got like 10 plus questions to get through. So I'm hoping I can hit all of these questions before my hour is up. And I know I started late and I had some tech issues. My microphone was acting up. It didn't want to actually connect to my USB port, so that was a problem as well. But anyway, question number 2. This is also from Lizzie. We've learned a lot about how chimpanzees and other ape species share and distribute food. Do we know how or if early human species did the same? So this question, I sort of did a little bit of research on, but I mean, you can also sort of thought experiment this out from an archaeological theory perspective. Basically, the evidence for finding food is going to be really hard to find directly in the archaeological record, right? How are you going to say from skeletal remains and material culture that this food was shared and not just eaten by one person? We can reasonably assume that once humans started hunting as opposed to scavenging, this would also lead to sharing food. And this has a lot to do with like a single kill site or a single kill from a hunt is more food than any one person can eat before the meat goes bad. I mean, think about like the biggest, I mean, sorry to all the vegetarians out there. I try to be vegetarian as often as I can, but you know, that's neither here nor there. But think about how much meat you could reasonably consume in a day in the 21st century. Like, how many steaks could you be eating before you get full? And, you know, obviously a cow is a different exception, but there's a lot of prime cuts on a deer that is not the size of a cow that no one person could reasonably be expected to eat before it all goes to waste. So there's the incentive of sharing because you can't possibly eat all those calories before it goes bad. And also the risk of failing to hunt and the risk of, and this is something that we talk about in the human evolution class, but there's a trade-off. So when you go hunting and you share, the trade-off is, well, it's sort of like a old school insurance policy before Geico and Liberty existed, right? This idea that, well, if I go on a hunt and I share with you, that means if you go on a hunt and you fail, I'm still sharing my hunt, not my successful hunt, And if I fail in my hunt, you're sharing your food, so that we're sort of spreading the risk of not coming, or spreading the risk of coming home empty-handed by ensuring that, one of the 5 people who went out to hunt today is going to be successful. So there's sort of an evolutionary incentive, like a selective pressure towards sharing, because if you're going to go actively hunting, there's a risk that you spend all of these calories, all this energy on like tracking an animal, like walking miles upon miles. You could become food for a predator, like you could get attacked by a cave bear, or a cheetah or a hyena or whatever you might, or a lion. So there's risks involved with hunting, and so you offset those risks through sharing. If this person got a successful hunt, then they need to share, and there's the incentive of not wasting that food. So like, why would you go after large game if you're just going to throw it away? That's a high risk, low return on investment for one individual. You should just stick to small game at that point. So there's a lot of different factors that lead to sharing being not directly observed, but we can indirectly observe it through the kinds of foods that people were eating in the past. Lizzie has one more question that I will answer, and that question is, other than finding species together or in the same vicinity, is there evidence that hominins, or hominids in this question, stayed together in family or community units? So what you're proposing, Lizzie, is kinship studies for early hominins, and there just isn't enough data to make any meaningful conclusions or interpretations about kinship in, 1 million plus years ago, or even 3 million years ago, if we're talking like, Australopithecus afarensis. I would say the closest example we have of there's not a lot of examples, but the only one that comes to mind, which is a very famous example, is found in the 70s. It's called the First Family. It was a site in Hadar, Ethiopia. It's a collection of 13 individuals, 9 adults and 4 children, who tragically died in a flash flood incident, and they were all Australopithecus afarensis. So it's sort of, because it was a single flood event and they were all found in the same layer, like they were all deposited in the same stratigraphic layer, because the soil that they were deposited in was the flash flood soils that they tragically drowned in. This is one of the only examples we have that people were in small family units. But beyond that, we just don't have enough skeletal samples we barely have enough to make interpretations and discussions of differences between the sexes, if there are differences, that is. We don't have a lot of representative samples to make very big inferences or interpretations based on social ties and kinship, and we couldn't even approach the idea of who we would call your father's brother on his side versus your father's brother-in-law, so your mother's brother, like kinship terms, like that's beyond the scope of what we could possibly imagine right now in human evolution studies. But we can at least reasonably say that small groups probably centered around kinship ties. So I think some more recent studies looking at foraging communities and using genetic statistical computations, basically running computer models of genetic variation and the minimum group size you would need in order to sustain genetic variation to the point that you wouldn't have like interbreeding that would cause like genetic deficiencies. Basically, brothers mating with sisters, fathers mating with siblings, or fathers mating with their offspring, those sorts of situations which would lead to genetic defects. The minimum number of individuals that you would need, the general consensus in genetics is that you need a group of 25, population size of 25. So probably that's the size that we're looking at for most hominins in the past, but that's, again, we don't have any direct observations. That's more based on genetic and statistical interpolations, basically like here's the minimum number of individuals you need in order to not end up with debilitating birth defects because you have the same genetic sequence being regurgitated. And this also gets into the thing of like marrying first cousins genetically. It's a common thing that happened in England in the 19th century, and in fact there's only I think 8 states in the United States that ban first cousin marriage, and first cousins are oftentimes part of arranged marriages. So from a genetic standpoint, first cousins actually aren't that much of a genetic risk. I'm not encouraging people to go out and date their first cousins. That is not what I'm saying. There's a lot of cultural taboos around it. But from a geneticist standpoint, that's, not really a concern. But certainly brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters, and that kind of stuff that we immediately have taboos on, like almost universally cultural taboos, and we don't have a good explanation for those taboos in terms of, chicken and egg. Is it because there's genetic defects related to that close of genetic reproduction, or how did that evolve? We don't really have a good answer at the moment. I don't know how I ended up there from your question, Lizzie, but I hope that answers it. We're going to move on then from Lizzie's questions to Destiny's questions. So Destiny has 2 questions here. The first question that Destiny has is, did Neanderthals, and yes, I said Neanderthals, not Neanderthals, Neanderthals become extinct just through the process of evolution, or did something happen similar to what happened to dinosaurs? Do scientists believe the same thing will happen to modern-day humans? So the unpacking of this question requires us to understand what we would consider an extinction event. Generally speaking, Neanderthals we consider to have gone extinct around 40,000 years ago. There are several genomes that are linked to Neanderthals in the modern Homo sapiens genome. So the Smithsonian estimates between 1 and 4% of non-African modern humans can trace their genomes to Neanderthals, meaning we share common ancestry with Neanderthals, roughly 1% of our genome, up to 4%. Now, Homo sapiens living at the same time as Neanderthals, so this would be contemporaries, say you're in Western France 40,000 years ago, and you're Neanderthal and you're Homo sapien. The Homo sapien shares about 6 to 9% of the same DNA as a Neanderthal. So there's a much higher correlation of genomes swapping and interbreeding of contemporary humans to Neanderthals. So some of the explanations for this quote-unquote extinction event are competition from Homo sapiens. So they just got outcompeted. They couldn't keep up with resource extraction. If they're hunting, humans came in, out-hunted them, so they couldn't hunt for the same resources. Another explanation that's commonly used is small population size. So it basically is sort of a feedback loop of, you're down on your luck, or what we would call in cultural anthropology the spiral of poverty, spiral of low population size is what I would call it here. Is, a disease decimates the population so that you're 1/10 of the size that you used to be. You were already a small population, so now it becomes even more difficult to sustain the gene pool, and then you're being outcompeted by humans. And then you factor onto that the Pleistocene, the Ice Age. There's a warming period happening around 40,000 years ago, so the climate is getting hotter. And, just as we're learning today with climate change studies, that, these are not like, it's not like it's a wild 20 degree Celsius swing in temperature. Even just a 1 to 2 degree change in the overall average annual temperature can lead to wildly different distributions of plants and animals, which might factor into a small population size not being able to adapt because they can't migrate and follow the same animal migrations, or there are fewer large game because they're dying off, because that 2 degrees change Celsius is leading to differential access to resources that's decreasing their populations. And so, it's sort of this, because you're already a small population and then you're finding less and less resources for that small population, there's fewer and fewer opportunities to reproduce because there's fewer and fewer people. It's sort of, like I said, a feedback loop. So a lot of anthropologists today would sort of say it's not one factor in particular, but a sort of perfect storm of, Homo sapiens interbreeding with Neanderthals. That sort of, did they really go extinct, or was this sort of a quote-unquote assimilation of Neanderthal, I almost said GNA, combining genes and DNA, Neanderthal DNA with modern Homo sapiens, or is it some other complex factor here? And so that's basically the long and short of it. I mean, I'm sure someone has a hot take where they say, no, it's definitively climate change is what led to Neanderthal extinction, and others might argue it's being outcompeted by Homo sapiens. Now, whether or not the same thing will happen to modern day humans, I mean, there are, 8 billion humans on the planet right now. I think the problem that modern humans are facing is social and culturally constructed constraints and not necessarily environmental ones. You know, if we were taking my cultural anthropology class, we'd be talking about how the ability to distribute resources through a marketplace economy and different economic modes might be sort of the limiting factor right now, and not necessarily the ability to produce calories. Because certainly we can produce plenty of calories through industrialized agriculture. It's just a matter of getting those calories in the form of foods that are nutritionally available to the people that need them. So, maybe that's just me being the optimist that I'm not concerned that, like, I don't take a Malthusian approach of, because there are complications. There's a lot of baggage that comes with the Malthusian approach of, there's a carrying capacity to the globe. And it's like, well, I mean, I suppose there is, but I don't think we're at it with 8 billion. We might be at it with 8 billion if we assume that everyone has to have an iPhone and everyone has to have a laptop and everyone has to have, a car and everyone has to have, a single family dwelling. If all 8 billion of us need that, then certainly we're going to reach a limit. But I think, again, it's more a cultural restriction than it is on an environmental one. But that's a whole nother topic that I think is beyond the scope of your question, Destiny. I hope that at least gives you some insight into your questions and hopefully is a satisfactory enough answer for you. Now, your next question, also from Destiny, is, I know that early human ancestors had to eat animals as we do today. However, they may have had to eat them raw. Do you think that sicknesses that we may get also affected our ancestors by eating raw animals? Or do you think they were immune to disease, and with time and evolution, we became less immune? So this is an interesting question, I think, mostly because it gets at the question of, were we scavengers or were we hunters? Recent studies in the journal Nature, which is like the primo journal to publish sort of physical anthropology studies, more recent scholarship in the journal Nature, sorry, I really lost my thought train there, got derailed, debate the date of which the shift towards meat being a significant part of hominid diet. In like most discussions within sort of academic and scholarly fields focus on discussions of when the shift occurred to higher meat consumption. I mean, obviously we have our dentition, our teeth are more oriented towards eating a mix of things, whether that's nuts and seeds, fruits, gums and resins, meat. We can eat a lot of different things, but meat becomes a more significant part of the diet, probably with afarensis like 3 million years ago. But the other thing to consider is what that meat looks like. So scavenging seems to be the first meat that humans are consuming, and it's opportunistic. So it's marrow and it's fresh kills. So when you think of a fresh kill site, just like sushi today is eaten raw, and you could, technically speaking, if you killed a deer and ate it right then and there, your risk of getting a foodborne illness is, I don't want to say low, but certainly it would be surprising how not dangerous it would be. I know today we think of it as dangerous. To be clear, I am not saying you should go out and eat raw meat. However, we have to put it in the context of the gut microbiome almost definitely was different for afarensis and Homo habilis, Homo erectus, who were probably eating meat raw. But you also have to remember that they're eating bone marrow a lot of the time. Like, a lot of the earliest stone tools are for extracting marrow. Bone marrow is basically like the original canned food, like the original canned meat, because the bone encasing the marrow acts like a can. It's protecting the marrow from decomposing. It's one of the last sort of edible meat-like substances that you can extract from a carcass, or rather, it's the longest lasting, I should say, not the last. It's one of the longest lasting. It's a highly nutritious, highly dense in fat, so it's very filling. If you fill up on bone marrow, you won't need as much to feel full. Highly dense in calories, and like I said, it's also basically canned. Whereas the rest of the muscle tissue that we would consider meat, or the organs. Organs are going to be the first to decompose. So things like livers, spleens, kidneys, those are going to decompose really fast. Eyes are going to last a little bit longer because they're basically like encased in like a gelatinous packaging. They also contain water. So if you're in a survival situation and you need water, eyeballs have lots of water in them. Sorry, this turned squeamish and gross real fast. But yeah, like the traditional muscle tissue, if you're scavenging a kill that's happened within like the last couple of hours, that's not a long time for sort of decomp and bacterial infections to get in. Obviously, there's a risk there, and fire drastically reduces that. So that's not to say that people didn't die of foodborne illnesses, but when you think about it in the sense of marrow is what they're predominantly eating, the risks are a lot lower. And the gut microbiome being a lot, I guess you could say, hardier, having bacteria in your gut that are basically built different to basically break down raw meat and to sort of fight off the bad bacteria that might otherwise get you sick. So it's a yes and a no. I think it boils down to, boils down, pun intended, right? Because, cook your meats. The microbiome certainly has changed over the last 3 million years, but it's also a case of the kinds of meat that they're eating and the proportions that they're eating. We are eating more meat now than humans have ever eaten, ever. It is orders of magnitude. Even for someone who, if you're only eating meat, let's say 3 to 4 times a week, like you're buying chicken at the store 3 to 4 times a week, you would still be eating significantly more meat than most people eat or have eaten in human history. Again, because it comes back to hunting and how often you're going to find a kill, and if that meat will preserve. Obviously, cooking it makes it last a little bit longer, but yeah, our meat consumption today, especially for Americans, is just off the charts. No comparison to what humans were eating prehistorically. And we know this through things like vitamin A deficiencies or poisoning. If you eat too much vitamin A from eating things like, livers, then you're going to get vitamin A poisoning. And also just looking at like strontium isotope analysis in human bones, and just looking at archaeological examples of like how many animals were killed at certain sites. It's meat consumption. This is not to downplay the importance of meat consumption, but certainly with the ability to farm and domesticate animals, meat consumption is higher than it's ever been. So anyone who's trying to pitch you paleo diet doesn't understand Paleolithic lifestyle at all. And that's my one, critique of paleo. So you're never going to hear me say it's a good diet. Okay, so it's 11:40. I got 20 minutes left to answer the rest of these questions. And I haven't even taken a break yet. So I think I'm just going to have to try and plow through it. I'm going to take one sip here, and then we're just going to keep rolling along here because there's still a lot of questions to answer here. Okay, so Noor has a couple questions. Thanks, Noor, and thanks, Destiny, thanks, Lizzie, and I think those are all the people that I have answered questions for so far. But thank you guys for sending in questions. But Noor asks, why was the Cheddar Man referred to as the Cheddar Man, and did it have anything to do with his diet? So the Cheddar Man is a early human ancestor fossil dating to, I think, like 9,000 BCE, found in England. And no, the Cheddar Man does not get his name from eating cheddar. Cheeses, basically any food that you think of today didn't exist pretty much 10,000 years ago, which is right around when Cheddar Man would have been alive. And so Cheddar Man gets his name from Cheddar, England, which gets its name from an Old English word for deep, dark cavity or pouch, which is, there's a giant gorge in Cheddar, the Cheddar Gorge, which is where Cheddar Man was found. Obviously, if a gorge is an ideal setting to find fossil remains because it's, being cut by a stream or water and exposing stratigraphic layers deep in time. So you're able to just sort of see from the side what would normally be difficult to excavate if you're coming from the top down. So yeah, Cheddar Man is just named for Cheddar, England, not for any cheddar that he was eating. But it is it is a fun name nonetheless to be like, ah, yes, Cheddar Man. What's interesting about Cheddar Man is after his discovery, there is sort of this groundswell interest and focal point of British pride around Cheddar Man being like the quote first Brit. But what's interesting about Cheddar Man is I think the recent scholarship says about 10 to 15% of Europeans at this time had a genetic sequence showing there was sort of a what they called the Neolithic migration, so people coming in from sort of the Levant, which is like the modern day Israel, Lebanon region, Sinai Peninsula, Turkey, moving into Europe around this time, and that genetic sequence we see play out in people like Cheddar Man, and I think there's a couple other examples in like Germany. And so Cheddar Man actually probably was dark-skinned, almost black-skinned, based on the genetic sequencing in Cheddar Man's DNA, because Cheddar Man is also a young enough fossil to still have DNA that was extracted and sequenced. And so Cheddar Man sort of raises this question of where light-skinnedness develops and the impetus for it. So we know that sort of the lack of pigmentation that creates white skin is associated with using UV radiation to make vitamin D in the skin, which often happens in northern latitudes where there is less and less sunlight, both during the year and also during, just in general because of the angle at which you're getting sunlight, you're getting less of it and it's diffused, so you're getting less UV radiation. But because of finds like Cheddar Man, the argument is that you should be able to get enough vitamin D in your diet without needing to supplement it with the creation that you would get from the sun. And so things like agriculture, eating a bunch of cereals, which aren't necessarily high in vitamin D, or sort of eating the same thing over and over again, which is more common when you start producing crops and growing things. Sure, there's plenty of vitamin D in lots of different food sources, but if your diet's not varied, which oftentimes is what happens with agricultural societies, they're like, well, we depend on this cereal grain and we know we can eat it and it's a lot less risky than hunting, so we're going to just eat that. Archaeologically, it's across the board. A lot of people would just eat like porridge of some cereal. But when that is introduced is when we are thinking archaeologically that there's a selective pressure for lighter skin because you're not getting enough vitamin D in your diet because you're eating not a high enough variable diet. And that's one of the reasons why you would see the Sami, which are above the Arctic Circle, don't really have white skin. They have actually darker skin than people in England, and a lot of that has to do with the variation in their diet and getting enough vitamin D from the food sources that they have as opposed to agriculture. So there is a correlation, but it's not, I wouldn't say right now that it's a done deal. We for sure know that, but there's a strong correlation between the two, agriculture and the resulting need for more vitamin D to supplement your diet. So the next question that Noor has is, can you please explain the main differences between tropical and Arctic body proportions? Can you further explain why such differences existed and how they contributed to survival? So Noor, what you're asking what you're describing is what's known as Bergmann's law, Bergmann's rule, which Bergmann was a physicist, naturalist, and all-around scientist person in the 18th century, who argued that there is a strong correlation between body size and ambient temperature of the environment. Now, anthropologists since the 80s have largely discredited this as a spurious correlation. Temperature has nothing to do with body size of animals, because if that were the case, then elephants shouldn't be in Africa because it's hot. Meanwhile, you would expect Africans to be in the Arctic, but they aren't. And so this idea that Bergmann's rule is about temperature, it's purely related to scarcity of resources and access to resources. So the more common argument is that size is related to the availability of vegetation. So a good example in human ancestors, or I guess you could say human relatives, would be gorillas, who are pretty large for their size because they need to eat a lot of leaf vegetation and need a large gut to process that leaf vegetation. Because basically think of it in the sense of the more abundantly available the food source, the lower quality it is, which means you have to have more gut space to process it, which is why when you look at large, herbivores, they have huge guts because they're chewing all day long to break down that food, and then it gets sent in the gut where it slowly is broken down into its various different amino acids and proteins that the animal then uses. So you need a lot of leaves to get the same quality of nutrition and content and calories as, say, a cut of meat. And so because of that, you have large guts, and so it has more to do with vegetation, which incidentally has to do with sunlight, which is related to latitude. So when you're above the Arctic Circle, you don't have a lot of green foliage to eat from, so you're going to have a very limited growing season from which to fatten up to survive the winter. And so it's not necessarily because the temperature is cold, but because you don't have a lot of rainfall. So you might also see that with places with lower rainfall. So camels, great example. Camels are pretty big. I mean, if you've ever stood next to a camel, they're not small. And they store a lot of water and fat for when they can't access vegetation to eat from. And so it has more to do with the access to food resources than it does with temperature. Now, there is a correlation that we can statistically demonstrate and is backed by evolutionary science of altitude and body proportions. When you're living at a higher altitude, which pretty much there's only 2 regions, maybe a third, arguably speaking, in Ethiopia, but the 2 main regions are the Tibetan Plateau and the Andean Highlands. And in both those places, the oxygen content is significantly lower than pretty much everywhere else in the world, so you have to have a body that adapts for it. And this is a classic case of anyone who's been to Peru will get lightheaded, or even someone who goes to Denver, Colorado, will get lightheaded because of the altitude sickness, because there's less oxygen in the air. And so to adapt to that, the body expands the chest to allow for a larger lung capacity, so that with each breath you're taking in more air, which means you're enabling your lungs to get more oxygen. You're oftentimes having shorter limbs, not because it's colder, but because shorter limbs are more efficient for blood flow for when you have less oxygen. So if there's less oxygen in the air, you need to accommodate for that by having shorter, stockier limbs and larger barrel chests to take in more air. And so those are things that are adaptations to a lower oxygen environment. But that's not Bergman's rule. That is altitude related. Okay, so we've got another question here from George. And actually, I think, well, I have a note here for one of the Journal of Physical Anthropology that it came out in 2022 talking about Bergman's rule being sort of a, quote, just so story, which for some reason physical anthropologists loved quoting Rudyard Kipling and his, quote, just so stories, because I think a lot of physical anthropologists get into these sort of hypotheticals and hypotheses that they really latch onto and get married to because it helps them get a PhD and land tenure. And so they love regurgitating this idea of, oh, well, Bergman's rule is a just so story, or the idea of why humans walked upright is a just so story. And the context being Rudyard Kipling had a story that explained away a lot of phenomenon as, well, why do we do this? Because it was just so, because it is. And I tell you, physical anthropologists can be real catty and real drama generators. I will say that. I only say that because of the headline of that article from Physical Anthropology journal that I was going to link in the show notes. But show notes? Did I just call these show notes? Oh man, I wouldn't really call this a show, but suffice to say, if I can figure out how to add them to the live stream after the fact, I will. Okay, so we've got 3 questions from George and a question from Cole. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer them in 9 minutes, but we're going to give it a crack. All right, so George asks, how long does it take to become a licensed archaeologist? So the answer is no time at all, because there's no licensing process for archaeology, at least not within the United States. Maybe there is in the UK. I don't know of the processes out, because I live in the United States. I practice archaeology in the United States, so I can only answer this from the US perspective. So there's no licensing to become an archaeologist in the US. There are standards that are set out by the Department of Interior's secretary, and we call those the Secretary of Interior Standards for Archaeologist, Historic Architect, and Historian. And basically it just outlines what you need to have in terms of educational achievements, in terms of sorry, there's people outside. I don't know if you can hear them. Got distracted. Educational attainment, project management, years of experience supervising in the field and also being supervised in the field. And generally speaking, those are used to identify who can be a principal investigator. Basically, think of it as, in general, there's like a 3-tiered system. There's field technicians, which are bottom of the barrel, like your privates in the military. They take orders, they don't give orders. They do the digging. They don't ask why they're digging or where they're digging. They just do the digging. They find artifacts. They survey landscapes. Sometimes write reports. Crew chiefs supervise field techs, and they're oftentimes coordinating and writing some of the reports. They're doing some of the preliminary research. They're coordinating on the ground, making sure the team is safe, making sure that the team gets the project done to completion when they're in the field so that there's no delays. And then there's the principal investigators. Principal investigator basically is someone who signs off and approves the recommendations of the report or the findings. And, when I talk about the Secretary of Interior standards, basically you just have people that read through them and say, yeah, this person, looking at their resume or their CV, they meet the Secretary of Interior standards for an archaeologist, and thus, if they want to be a PI on this project and sign off on the report, they can. That's the sort of licensing process. Would it be great if we had a licensing process like electricians or realtors or doctors? Yes, I think that would be very beneficial for archaeology, but as it stands, that does not exist. The next question that George asks is, what ethical considerations come into play when dealing with ancient human remains or cultural artifacts? So it really depends on where you find them. The reason we have laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in the United States are because of the legacy of colonialism on indigenous communities enacted by anthropologists in the past. So a really sort of unsavory example of this would be Samuel Morton, who was a physician who lived in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. Put forth a lot of racial science stuff, arguing like the biological concept of race was legitimate, and made some pretty horrible racist science to looking at skull sizes. And he actually commissioned U.S. soldiers to send him skulls of enslaved Africans, of Native Americans, immigrants, white people who usually had unclaimed dead, so people who died on poor farms or infirmaries. He would buy them up to use for his sample. So, setting aside the possibility that he was basically putting bounties out on people's heads, literally, there's also, if this is how living populations or the recently deceased were perceived of sort of black, indigenous, and people of color communities, then you can imagine that the ancient and ancestral dead were not treated any differently, or in fact worse. And even today within the United States, we have very minimal laws protecting unmarked graves, and a lot of that has to do, if we boil it down into the most simplest terms, basically you have enslaved African communities, Native American communities being dug up by non-Native, non-African communities, without having any sort of regulation on when and why you can dig those things up. Germans digging up German people from thousands of years ago generally, isn't an issue. But then you also run into the issue of there aren't any descendant communities that can speak up or have the sort of platform in order to speak up on behalf of their ancestors, oftentimes because the graves are unmarked, so there's no clear lineal descent chain, whereas a marked grave and a burial usually has some direct descendant that could stop the process of digging up those remains. Whereas that's not necessarily the case when you have a mound burial from 2,000 years ago. Now, granted, you have mound burials in England, but it's a different story when you have someone who's from England digging up English graves versus someone who's English ancestry digging up someone who has Native American ancestry without consulting with Native communities or descendant communities. And we see this also sort of happening in physical anthropology, where up until recently, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania had largely American and English anthropologists studying the sites, or in South Africa. I mean, you look at where a lot of the archaeology was being done in the early human evolution studies. Louis Leakey, you could make the argument that he was Kenyan, but why was he born in Kenya? Because Kenya was a recently acquired colony of England at that point, which would have been late 19th, early 20th century. You know, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. A lot of the early studies in human evolution were done by people who directly benefited from colonialism. You know, Sterkfontein, Eugene Dubois? I think that's what his name. Maybe I'm misremembering. But Java Man, the Trinil site in Indonesia, found by a guy who was working for the East India Company for the Dutch. You know, excavations done in South Africa were done by someone who was directly benefiting from apartheid. Although I don't think apartheid existed at the time that he's doing excavations. But point being, there is this legacy, and those are what we have to consider when we consider ethics. Someone who, you know, is Kenyan, has ancestry in Kenya, doing Kenyan archaeology, it's a very different story than someone from, you know, London coming in to do Kenyan anthropology and archaeology. And so that's really the ethical considerations, is making sure you consult with stakeholders and community holders that should be consulted when it's on their land, ancestral land, or those are their ancestors directly. Even if we can't necessarily say that's like my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, we can make a more reasoned assumption that that is their, you know, lineal descendant than someone who's coming in from, you know, England. Oh man, and it's 11:58. I don't know. I could probably keep going, but I kind of want to. I'll do one more, because I think yeah, George has one more question here that I'm going to answer, and then we'll stop there and we'll save Cole's question and Aria's question for the next week's live stream. So George's last question here is, how do archaeologists decide where to excavate and how deep to dig? Well, so to answer that question, I guess I should plug my archaeology class, Anthro 2110. You should just take that next semester, and that goes to anyone else who's listening to this question. Cuyahoga Community College is an open enrollment community college, and the class is being taught online, so you can take it remotely. And there are ways to teach archaeology remotely. Believe me, I know how to do it. I've been doing it for 5 years. But there are lots of different methods that can be applied for surveying in archaeology, and so it really depends on what you're trying to find and where you're trying to find it. Like, for example, the depth of a site, like how deep to dig, depends on where you're at. Depends on the local conditions of the soil deposition. So, for example, here in Ohio, usually if you're digging up an upland site, so that's like up on a hill or a ridge top, that only has leaves and grass that are generating the organic material which soil comes from. So soil is basically just decomposing plant and organic matter that is built up over time. And in some cases, it's erosion from, you know, sediments like rocks and whatnot. But in an upland context, it's basically just organic material. So it takes a long time to build up. Whereas something like the Ohio River floodplain is being flooded annually by the Ohio River, which is a pretty big river, which is depositing lots and lots of soils that are being pulled from all sorts of things upstream. So, you know, you might be able to dig through 12,000 years of human history in an upland context in Ohio, but if you wanted to dig through 12,000 years of history in the Ohio River floodplain, you might have to dig 30 feet or more. And so it really just depends on the depositional rate of the places that you're digging. And so anytime you have something near a river where that river is going to flood and with any sort of regularity, you're going to have a much deeper stratified site than in a place that's up on a hilltop where there's not a lot of material that's being deposited because it's higher up. So, you know, things go downhill because gravity pulls them closer to the earth. And if there's no water there to pull them closer to the site, then it's just not going to have a high deposition rate. So things that are higher away, or I guess higher above sea level, are generally going to have a shallower deposition of artifacts. So that's the short answer in terms of where to look for artifacts and archaeological sites. It really depends on where you're searching around the globe, and that would be a more specific question that could be answered in an archaeology class like Anth 2110, which is my archaeology class that I'll be teaching next spring. I think it starts January 19th 19th, I think. Well, in any event, I don't need to plug my classes here. Just go take them if you want. They're very affordable. I think Tri-C has some of the lowest tuition rates in the state, some of the lowest in the country. So if you're really interested in taking a class with me, I highly recommend. And that's the dirty promotional work that I'm willing to do for this session. We've got one more for the semester and one more for the year. That's December 14th at 11 a.m. Hopefully I won't have any tech issues, so I'll be able to start right at 11. And until then, if you have any questions that you want answered that are related to anthropology, please email tricanthropology@gmail.com. Or if you're in one of my classes, just email me at my university, or not my university, my college email. And until then, I will